Erica Kurcsack, our good friend from Maranatha Bible Church, where she leads the ministry Grace and Beauty. Welcome back, Erica. Oh, we got to get her mic going. Are we there?
Really bad morning show engineer. Okay, I think we're ready to go.
All right. Good morning.
You went and hung out with my wifey, actually, at it last time.
Yes.
That's nice.
Good time.
Yeah. You like a good women's conference now and again.
Absolutely.
Ladies like a good cry, don't they? Isn't that what?
You don't have to cry.
There's no required crying at the
No.
Renew Women's Conference.
You can if you want to. It's welcome, but you also don't have to.
Are you going to cry?
Probably not.
Okay. I could work on that. Pinch her real hard.
If you touch me.
You'll be crying.
No doubt that will happen. Erica, so good to have you here. Your husband, Nathan, is the missions pastor at the church. He's been on the show many times with us. We call him affectionately Dr. Hottie. I'm not certain if that's what you call him at home yet.
Not
He
yet.
just
Maybe
got
you could
his
start.
doctorate.
Yeah, I think you're the only one that calls him that.
I'm
That's
trying to see if it'll
surprising.
catch on.
Why did you start doing that? That's
Because
weird.
I
don't
knew
like
he would be
that.
uncomfortable with that, and for some reason that entertains me. I don't know why that entertains me, but it does. But that's not why Erica's here. Erica, you helped launch and now run Grace and Beauty, which is a unique ministry. I'm not seeing many other places doing this kind of thing. Help us understand, again, what is Grace and Beauty?
So Grace and Beauty essentially is a support group for women who are walking through infertility, miscarriage, stillbirth, or the death of a child.
And you've shared with us before that that you've been through some of these things in a way that it's not just that you're trying to be a sympathetic woman. You can offer empathy in these situations. You went through miscarriage, as I recall.
Yes.
It's such a difficult thing. And why do you think that this isn't much more prevalent of a ministry around the country?
I think most women are kind of grieving alone because nobody's really talking about it, so it doesn't really give you a safe space to talk about it. And most people don't know what to say, to be honest. If you haven't experienced it, it's a difficult thing, and so to know how to talk about. So people usually just say nothing, which ends up being even more hurtful when you're alone.
Well, and then how do you bring it up is the other thing. It's like many difficult things in life. You can't just, hey, how you doing? Actually, not that great. Guess what just happened to me? I mean, there's not many opportunities to share that kind of pain.
Right. And I think that's what makes Grace and Beauty unique. I mean, it was birthed out of the suffering of one of my really close friends. Actually, 7 years ago this week, in fact, she lost her baby, Annabelle, at 36 weeks of pregnancy. And we were all just so shocked and devastated. It was unexpected. It was unexplainable. And so over the course of those next several months, just a close community of us friends just leaned into her and loved on her, and we cried with her. We helped her just sit and listen with her, really, as she processed through her raw emotions, and really kind of watched as she leaned towards the Lord rather than away from him, even though she was angry and struggling. And so I think because of that, fast forward 4 years, she really felt like her heart's desire was to see that no woman would have to walk through that kind of thing alone. And so she really felt led to start this group. And the Lord has allowed us to create that safe space for women to grieve together, to ask their tough questions together, and just kind of remind each other of truth when they're in a dark place where you can't really remember what the truth is yourself.
Well, and because you were relatively, if not completely alone. I mean, apart from your husband, you didn't have that support system at the time.
Right. Yeah.
And do you think part of that was because of your position as a pastor's wife, or you felt like you didn't have a support system in that sense, or what? Why were you alone in that?
Partly, but I think a lot of it was just because of my own personality. I tend to be more of a private person in general, and I also didn't have any. I was the first amongst my group of friends to get pregnant, and so I didn't know anybody else that had experienced this before, and so I didn't know how to talk about it to anybody.
Yeah, and who does? It's not something that's easy to discuss. And I think a lot of people don't do well training children in how to handle these situations where you can walk up to someone, look them in the eye and say, I'm so sorry about what you're going through. I've watched, even when you go to a funeral, There's people who can't even walk up to somebody who's mourning the loss of a loved one, who's an adult, and say something.
Mm-hmm.
Something we have to get better at.
Yeah.
It's too bad.
Yeah. I think people are afraid of saying the wrong thing and saying something that's hurtful, and so they don't say anything.
And that's worse, isn't it?
It is.
Why is it worse?
Well, it makes you feel like they don't care. It makes you feel like there must be something wrong with me if this is a big deal to me and nobody else is acknowledging it. It makes you start questioning yourself. So, but you're right. Just saying, I'm so sorry that's enough. Just give them a hug. Tell them you're so sorry.
Sometimes all it takes is that, and then being with them.
Mm-hmm.
Just the ministry of presence often is what people need,
Yeah, for sure.
as opposed to your words that won't help.
Mm-hmm.
That ultimately, as my counselor talked to me about at one point, they become about you anyway. And so
Yeah.
we don't need you to be the focus when your friend is suffering.
Right.
You want to chat with us today a little bit about 3 questions people ask when they're going through suffering. What's the first one?
Well, C.S. Lewis said that pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And I feel like that's so true. I mean, everyone that I've encountered who's walking through deep suffering, regardless of what their view of God was before, they start asking questions of God that perhaps they've never considered before. And I think that the first question simply is why? Just some form of why. Why is this happening? Why me? And people aren't usually just like asking that question to the air, right? They're asking God, why would you let this happen? And so it's really impossible and probably unhelpful to answer people's why questions. You're just asking these questions. And I think it's completely normal to ask the question. And it's not a sin. It's not wrong to ask God why he's allowing you to experience something. I mean, we know that because Jesus asked it. He asked it on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And so I think the distinction that's important is how we ask that question. Are we asking that question with a closed fist, shaking it in the face of God, or are we asking it with open hands, really wanting to hear from him? So if we get at the heart of what that person's really asking, though, I think it's a question of meaning. What could possibly be the point of this experience being a part of my story? And the assumption then is that suffering is just meaningless, which the opposite is actually true. Suffering is immensely meaningful from a biblical perspective. 2 Corinthians 4:17 tells us that it's producing a particular kind of glory in us, a glory that you cannot see, and we really can't even understand what that means. So, of course, this is an unseen work that God is doing, but we know that God is always after relationship, right? Whatever he's doing, he wants a deeper relationship with us. And so we're told in Scripture that we have fellowship with Christ when we're suffering. So what does that mean? It means that he's with us when we're suffering and that we can know him more intimately because we can relate to one another as fellow sufferers. I mean, that's part of what Grace and Beauty is all about. We're with someone else who's experienced the same thing, the same kind of suffering, and we have a deeper connection with them. And the same is true of Christ because he's experienced suffering as well. So at Grace and Beauty, we don't try to answer everybody's why questions.
Because you can't.
We can't. But our goal is to introduce people maybe in a new way to the God that they're asking that question of.
So just as a helpful point for someone listening, what do you say when someone asks that you're talking to a friend, why is God doing this to me?
Mm-hmm.
How do you respond to that as a friend?
Yeah. I would say, I don't know. I can't tell you why, but I can tell you that that God is with you in the suffering, and keep asking him, do you want me to learn something? But I think sometimes in the Christian community, we have this idea that, God is this grand schoolmaster who's always wanting to teach us lessons, and we just have to learn the lesson, and then everything's going to be fine. And that's not, God does want to teach us things, but he really is after our hearts. And so I wouldn't tell somebody you've got to figure this out if you're ever going to experience healing. You might never know why. Job never knew why he suffered. And the best thing that his friends ever did was to keep their mouths closed. You know, as soon as they
Right.
started talking, that's when things started going downhill because they were trying to explain and defend God. And God doesn't need us to do that.
Yeah, you can just say, I'm so sorry. I don't know. I don't know why.
Yeah.
So good. It's 7:49, time for a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue chatting with our friend Erica Kurcsack from Maranatha Bible Church with the ministry Grace and Beauty that ministers to and is a support group for women walking through infertility, miscarriage, stillbirth, and the death of a child. There's two more questions that people often ask when they're going through suffering. If you've been just tuning in here, we've got our friend Erica Kurcsack with us from Maranatha Bible Church and the ministry Grace and Beauty that ministers to women experiencing infertility, miscarriage, stillbirth, or the death of a child. We're going to get you connected to them in a minute because it's not just for their church members. There are not many support groups, if any, like this in the area, and they'd be happy to welcome you if you need a place. Again, just stick with us. We'll give you info in a minute. We're talking about three questions people ask when they're going through suffering. The first one you said was why, that existential question that God may or may not answer. What's the next one?
The second one is, where was God? You know, when this horrible thing was happening, where was God? And I think the underlying assumption then is either God is absent or that he's just not aware of everything that's going on in the world. There's like too much for him to keep track of, so to speak. And the simplest way that I know how to answer this question, if somebody were to ask me, would be to say, he was with you. He was right beside you. He was weeping with you when your world was falling apart, when your worst nightmare was coming true. And you probably weren't thinking about him or acknowledging him in that moment, but he was there. I mean, God is everywhere. Just because we don't see him or we don't see his activity or we don't feel him doesn't mean that he's not there. It doesn't change the truth that God is all present. So I think the enemy comes after us and starts whispering lies to us in our dark times. And even then, you may not see God, but he may be just holding back those forces of darkness that are trying to take over your soul and take over your heart and your mind and your thoughts. So not only is he with you, I think he's actually fighting for you against the enemy. When you feel like you don't have the strength to fight, you don't have that ability, he's not absent and he's not unaware. He sees us and he hurts right alongside with us.
Yeah, it's that feeling of being abandoned, right?
Absolutely.
And yet he hasn't abandoned us. And I think it's a hard one for folks to reconcile, that God's sovereignty extends over all things, even when things don't feel good or are tragic.
Mm-hmm.
His presence is constant. And that's so important.
Yeah.
And I think you were also hinting at, right, that we don't see what he protected us from in the midst of tragedy.
Right.
That even though something terrible happened, it could have been perhaps very, very much worse.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to see that.
It is.
And so in the moment, I would imagine, though, when someone says to you, where was God? All you can say, right, is like, he's with you.
Yeah.
And if they keep asking you, just like, he's with you and I'm with you.
Mm-hmm.
Like trying to theologically explain something to someone who's hurting usually is not a great idea, as I understand it.
No, it's not. People don't need those grand theological explanations. And sometimes even scripture can be used in a hurtful way. I mean, Romans 8:28 is like, most women in the group, that's their least favorite verse because people just slap that on like a Band-Aid on a broken arm. And the truth, it is true that God works all things together for good. That is true. But it is not what a woman in grief needs to hear in that moment. They need the presence of God. They need your presence more than they need to be. You know, it almost produces this guilt of, I really shouldn't be feeling this way.
Yeah, someone means to say something nice, but what you're telling them is, this is good.
Losing a baby is not good.
No,
Right.
It's not good. And you don't need to remind them about this because God will reveal that truth to them in his perfect timing.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't ask you to remind them of that in the midst of their grief.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he told us to weep with those who weep,
Yes.
as opposed to theologically correct and cheer up the person who's...
Right.
I mean, I had a friend who they went through a miscarriage and someone looked at him and said, well, at least you have another kid.
Mm-mm.
Well,
Don't ever say
thanks
that.
for helping me look at the bright side of
Yeah.
death. Excuse me.
No, I mean, did Jesus say that to Mary or Martha? Well, at least you still have your sister. even though Lazarus is gone.
Cheer up.
No,
No.
he wept with them.
Yeah, and it's, again, we worry about what to say, and yet it's shockingly simple. That's so good. Okay, so the third question people often ask.
Yeah, the third question, I think a lot of us have heard this question before. How can God be good if he allows this kind of evil in the world? And this question, I think, is especially prevalent with miscarriage and stillbirth because it involves an innocent baby.
Yeah.
And the assumption here is that either God is not good or he's not powerful enough to stop the evil. And the truth is that we live in a fallen world that's under the curse of sin. So Adam and Eve's sin in the garden didn't just affect all of mankind. It brought sin into all of the created world. And so sometimes bad things happen, like unspeakably bad things. Some of the stories I've heard, it's unimaginable. But remember, death was not part of God's original design for mankind. Death is a result of man's sin. So when we think about this question, how can God be good and still allow evil? It helps to recognize that God actually willingly allowed the worst kind of evil to happen to his own son. I mean, murder. That's talk about evil. And yet he allowed his son to die, the most excruciating death imaginable. God knows what it's like to lose a child. So if suffering is a sign that God doesn't love or that he doesn't care, how do we explain Christ's death on the cross? We can't. We know that God loves his son. So what if there was a bigger purpose that God had in mind, that he was willing to subject his son to suffering in order to see that purpose fulfilled? And so I think that the same can absolutely be said of our suffering. And again, this isn't meant to minimize the suffering or to say, oh, God has a bigger purpose. But it does allow us to have that trust and that peace and that hope, which we wouldn't have otherwise, that God knows what I'm going through. He's experienced the same thing, and he's with me in this.
Yeah, and the more you examine the life of Christ in the midst of pain, you find that. And when you feel alone in pain, you feel like, no one's been through this. No one understands me. Oh, wait. No, the Lord has been through this.
Mm-hmm.
He understands me. He's with me.
Yeah.
It's hard to describe, but that does bring comfort in the right moment.
It really does.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that the reality in asking any of these questions is that we're looking for someone to blame, right? We want to know who's to blame for this. And what if there is no cause and effect like that? What if we never know why God allows our heartaches and our losses? But what if we just allowed ourselves to believe that we can ask our questions with open hands and that we turn towards him instead of turning away from him, and that is what is kind of the first steps in healing, So ask your questions of God and get ready for an answer, because he will answer, and it's probably not the way that you're going to expect, but he's going to give you himself as the answer, regardless of what you feel about him. His feelings about you haven't changed.
I'm so glad that you and your friends answered the call that the Lord had for you, a difficult call to support women who've been through infertility, miscarriage, stillbirth, death of a child. It's such a lonely, unique experience filled with so much pain. And you did this at Maranatha Bible Church, and we're so grateful for it, Erica Kurcsack. For those listening who may not be a member of your church and want this kind of support, need this kind of support, how can they find out more information or get connected?
Mm-hmm. You can go to Maranatha's website, which is mbc95.org. And you can also follow us on Instagram, Grace and Beauty Ministries. And we meet the first Saturday of every month from 9 to 11.
Now, what can people expect? Like, oftentimes people are nervous about going somewhere new because they don't know what to expect. So you go on a Saturday, it's 9 a.m., you walk in the door.
Mm-hmm. We have women there to greet you and to help connect you with other people that are already there. Everybody there, including all the leaders, have experienced one of these things. And so we have a small teaching time, and then we break up into different small groups with questions to talk about. And a lot of times those questions, it just kind of becomes leaning on each other, crying with each other, sharing. And
You don't have to share if you don't want to.
you do not have to share if you do not want to.
It's not like AA where you have to stand up and say, "Hi, I'm Erica,"
No.
and
No, and if you feel uncomfortable going to a new place alone, bring a friend with you. Even if they haven't experienced it themselves, they can just be your support friend to come alongside of you.
It's wonderful. Again, Maranatha Bible Church in Akron. And for more information, worst case, come to us. And we would love to help you out. MBC95 is the website for the church, MBC95, and Grace and Beauty Ministries on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
Don't delay. Go do this. You don't need to be alone. There's followers of Jesus, ladies, who want to support you and love you.